Chapter 2. The Inquisitor's silver had done its work. The trail was a dark, rusted stain against the mud, thick splashes of blood that refused to wash away in the stinging drizzle. Stripped of the insulation of the sellswords' bodies, Wilhelm took point. They dragged their boots deeper through the labyrinth of the district. The dark pressed down on the streets like packed earth over a fresh coffin. The damp chill had long since burrowed into Wilhelm's marrow. His jaw clamped hard against his violently chattering teeth, his blistered soles protesting with every grinding step. But his eyes adjusted. He cleared every jagged shadow, every shattered masonry wall, every ruined doorway for their target. Inquisitor Vincent lit a small lantern and handed it off to Leonard. The sputtering flame scratched at Wilhelm's dilated pupils. It threw Wilhelm's shadow far ahead, stretching his silhouette across the rubble into a twitching giant. Every erratic flicker made the debris seem to writhe and breathe. They arrived at the terminus of the blood trail. Ahead, a church loomed out of the shadows. Its grand stone arches sagged like a collapsed ribcage, a fitting, open grave. The iron band crushing Wilhelm's lungs fractured. The next command was known before it was spoken. Possibilities flickered through his mind as his boots crept up the cracked steps. The dense wool of his coat chafed his elbows. The heavy wood of his weapon dug firmly into his shoulder. As he passed beneath the arches, the scent hit him like a physical wall. A foul runoff of wet fur and oxidized copper choked him, forcing him to swallow a rush of bitter bile. The dying rays of the sun pierced through the shattered framework of stained glass windows, casting long, fractured blades of light across the nave. A soft, rhythmic lapping whispered in the sanctuary. Like the snap of a dry femur, glass crushed under the heel of his boot. Tucked where a holy man once preached salvation lay a mockery of biology. It was a profane nightmare stitched together from wolf and famine, and it rose to meet its trespassers. The beast's shoulder crested just above Wilhelm's eye level a mountain of black and brown matted fur, drenched in the smell of churned earth. The waist was a starved thing, hollow where organs should be, leading up to a ribcage that threatened to burst from its chest. It did not stand upright. Its crushing weight was thrust forward, anchored to the stone by elongated arms. The same hand-like claws capable of cleanly severing a man's torso now bore the heavy burden of its impossible mass. Wilhelm sighted down the iron groove. He aligned the steel bolt with the subtle, labored rise and fall of the beast's ribs, right where its heart should be. The iron of the trigger bit into his skin. Like wet ink swallowing the light, its eyes met his. It had no discernible pupil, but its gaze carried a physical weight that pressed him into the floorboards. Its skull was that of a wolf, draped in dark, wet parchment pulled taut against the bone. Its ears twitched, a faint recognition of presence. Behind the creature, the church sneered. Soft linens and heavy furs were meticulously stacked against the floor, forming a deliberate shelter. Around its perimeter lay decorative tokens, statues, and books not, the work of a senseless, unthinking frenzy of a monster, or the haphazard scattering of abandoned goods. They were trinkets organized by kind, delicately carving a half-moon around the nest. Wilhelm's eyes locked onto the beast. It stood as a monument of perfect stillness. He searched that warped visage for a tell. Nothing. Those void eyes drank the light. He stared into the abyss, incapable of translating the predatory stillness into intent. Panic clawed up his throat. The truth here did not match the reality. The plague-born were mindless aberrations that attacked in a hurtling aggression born of hunger. Yet, this creature had climbed a swept corner of a rotting world. It collected possessions, objects assigned value enough to keep. When it slaughtered the scout and the sellswords, had it understood the implication of the church silver? Was this truly just a wild beast, or was it a person defending their home? Every drilled instinct screamed at him to pull the trigger. The plague-born were a disease-given teeth, stripped of anything resembling a soul. But those truths fractured against the evidence laid out in front of him. Rabid things did not curate collections. They did not carve out quiet sanctuaries in a dying world, nor did they bide their time. Was this beast truly his enemy? The silence stretched, pulling the tension taut like drying sinew. Wilhelm's heart battered against his ribs. He had marched into his own grave and pointed a weapon at its architect. He was a pathetic construct of brittle bone, ready to be rendered into ribbons. He knew with absolute certainty that this mass of muscle could bridge the gap before his finger finished the pull. Yet it remained anchored, waiting, yielding the first move. Wilhelm exhaled a ragged breath. Deliberately, he eased his finger off the cold iron. The dull ache in his shoulder flared as he slackened his arms. The crossbow dipped towards the floorboards. The beast's pelt rippled, its ears pinned back. The suffocating weight of its gaze released him, drifting past his shoulder. A voice cut through the heavy stillness. "Shoot the beast." He stepped smoothly beside Wilhelm, raising his left forearm. A mechanical click echoed in the cramped space as the mechanism beneath his heavy coat engaged. A sharp, metallic crack. The silver bolt snapped. But the creature was already gone. The bolt shattered uselessly against the stone wall where its skull had been a fraction of a second prior. The Inquisitor's hand blurred toward his hip. The hiss of his rapier cut the air butt. He was too late. The beast surged forward, a tidal wave of matted fur and muscle driving off its elongated limbs. Vincent lunged, bringing the steel up in a desperate defense. Wilhelm stood rooted, the heavy crossbow useless at his side. "Shoot." The trained infantryman inside his head screamed at him, but his finger refused to find the trigger. He had made his choice. He saw more than a beast butt. The unbridled savagery unfolding before him shattered that fragile empathy. The creature's sheer mass swallowed the Inquisitor's strike. The blade buried itself deep in the coarse muscle of its chest, but it did not break the beast's momentum. Its claws swept upwards. The church's boiled leather cracked like an ancient hull. Underneath, the Inquisitor's flesh sheared, 4 lines slicing upward through muscle and bone before hooking underneath his sternum. Blood poured from the man's chest as the beast hoisted him off the ground with a single claw. He hung suspended, his boots kicking uselessly. He choked on his own lifeblood as he hissed a final damnation, his arm trembling to drive the rapier in a second time. The beast did not let him finish. A flash of jagged teeth snapped around the Inquisitor's neck. With a whiplash jerk, it tore his throat out. Lines of burning crimson splashed against Wilhelm's face. The taste of copper coated the back of his throat, forcing him to choke on his own breath. Viscous fluid beaded down his cheek. The beast casually discarded the ruin of the man. Vincent struck the stone with a wet slap. Wilhelm did not wipe the stinging blood from his eyes. His attention was glued to the gutted Inquisitor. The wide-brimmed hat had rolled away, leaving a pale face locked in a hollow stare staring endlessly up at a shattered heaven that offered no salvation. A sickening weight dropped into Wilhelm's stomach. He had let this happen. The thought screamed in the silence of his skull. He had stayed his hand out of a misplaced sense of empathy, gambling on a flicker of intelligence in a monster's actions. In exchange, he had possibly traded a human life for a nightmare's right to exist. The catastrophic scale of his mistake threatened to buckle his knees. A wave of heat blazed across Wilhelm's throat. The beast eclipsed his vision. An all-encompassing heat radiated from its massive frame. Its warped visage hovered mere inches from his face, the dark fur slick with fresh gore. His body was anchored in place. Its breath washed over his skin a humid draft of fresh slaughter. The world shook as a grinding growl erupted from the dark hollow of the creature's chest. It leaned closer. Coarse fur scraped like rusted wire against Wilhelm's collar, scenting him, cataloging the sour reek of terror. Wilhelm's fingers went numb, and he let the heavy crossbow slide from his firing stance, the weapon dropping to hang limply from one hand, its cold iron stock resting against the floorboards. A frantic scuffling broke the silence. The beast's ears snapped rigid. Framed in the shattered archway stood Leonard. The penal soldier was a trembling ruin, his knuckles bleached against the rusted iron handle of the lantern. Erratic orange light washed over the corpse of the Inquisitor, climbed the nightmarish silhouette of the beast, and finally settled on Wilhelm. Leonard's manic eyes stretched wide. A strangled wheeze escaped his throat. The lantern slipped, clattering against the floor. The church drowned in sudden darkness. Leonard spun on his heels, blindly scrambling back out into the dark of the district. The beast's attention violently redirected. The rumble in its chest snapped into a predatory snarl. Its muscles coiled. It launched towards the church door. A grazing brush of the beast's flank struck Wilhelm with the force of a swinging anvil. His boots lifted from the floor. His body hit the wall. The air was punched from his lungs, leaving him gasping against the blinding pain of bruised ribs. He collapsed to his hands and knees. His palms plunged into the thick pool of the Inquisitor's spilled life. It stuck to his skin like warm tar. The gouging of the beast's claws against stone and timber echoed down the nave, growing fainter as it tore into the desolate streets behind Leonard. Wilhelm held his breath, waiting for the inevitable shriek. He waited for the wet, tearing sounds of a man being rendered into meat in the mud. A breath later. Rising above the relentless drumming of the rain outside, a howl tore the dead city open. It was a grating, raspy shriek that rattled the remaining stained glass in its leaden frames. Its echo scraped against the base of Wilhelm's skull. But it was the silence that followed that drove its nails into Wilhelm's chest. His lungs burned. Every shallow pull of the damp air was a wheezing struggle. Why did it leave him breathing? Wilhelm rose from the ground. His hand scrambled blindly across the slick floorboards, fingers hooking around the stock of his dropped weapon as he dragged himself upright. The bolt was still firmly secured in its groove. His boots slipped on the bloody floorboards before finding purchase. A blinding ache in his chest flared. He was still whole. He lifted his palms into the pale light. They were trembling violently, coated in a thick, wet crimson that dripped heavily from his fingertips. The Inquisitor's blood is on his hands. A sudden, violent wave of nausea doubled him over. He turned away from the gutted ruin of the holy man, dry heaving into the dark of the nave until his throat burned. When the spasms finally passed, he wiped his mouth with a blood-smeared sleeve and forced himself back to the corpse. Wilhelm had feared the man. The church was a tyrant of tithes and dogma, hoarding its protection behind its high walls. Inquisitor Vincent was the embodiment of the tan iron spike driven into the earth to hold the dark at bay. A ruthless but necessary source of safety. Now he was alone. Wilhelm knelt, his crossbow still clutched in one hand. His free hand shook violently as he reached for the dead man. He pried the rapier from stiffening fingers and unsecured the scabbard. The church steel was immaculate, perfectly balanced and terrifyingly sharp. It was a vast improvement over his blunt, rusted infantry sword. He hacked at the buckles of his own rusted scabbard until it dropped to the floorboards and quickly attached its replacement. The church would not be happy with the theft, but the greater requirement is to remain alive. He navigated the debris of the nave, pushing through a splintered side door. The night swallowed him. Freezing rain immediately plastered his heavy coat to his skin. He had marched through dead districts at night before, but always flanked by the insulating bodies of a full patrol. Even then, it was a dangerous task. Alone, he was nothing but walking carrion. If the beast wanted him, he could not outrun it. He could only pray its restraint was not a temporary condition. The adrenaline soured, leaving his limbs heavy and his vision swimming. He couldn't stay in the open. He dragged himself down a narrow street until he reached an abandoned townhouse. The heavy oak door lay in splinters across the threshold. He stepped inside. His boot kicked a spoon across the floorboards. The scrape was deafening. The foyer was a frozen memory. Slivers of moonlight passed through the boarded windows. An overturned dining table. Deep, frantic gouges carved into the hardwood, scattered silverware and shattered plates. Stains long since dried over both walls and floor. He forced his exhausted legs up a creaking stairwell. He found a master bedroom, mostly forgotten by time, and collapsed against the far wall. His body ached against the support. He stretched his aching legs out over the floorboards. The Inquisitor's rapier remained sheathed at his hip while he rested his crossbow between his knees. One hand clamped around the wooden stock. He faced the empty, pitch-black doorway. Time bled away. The frantic hammering of his heart finally slowed to a dull, bruised rhythm. The rain drummed against the roof. Then, a sound. Wood groaned on the ground floor. Wilhelm's breath locked in his throat. A heavy, wet scrape. The distinct click of elongated claws testing the hardwood. It followed him. The stairwell protested. The old timber shrieked under its mass. It was ascending, slow and deliberate. The steps ceased at the landing. The doorway remained an impenetrable rectangle of black. Wilhelm could not see the beast, but the air pressure shifted. He could hear it. It was there, watching him. It had spared him in the church, but why follow him? His exhausted nerves frayed. The silence was agonizing. If you are here to finish it, Wilhelm lifted the iron nose of the crossbow from the floor. Do it. It offered no reply, only the slow, rhythmic draft of its breath. The beast did not advance. It did not retreat. Whether or not there was intelligence behind its eyes, Wilhelm could not bet his life on its mercy. The standoff stretched. Far off in the district, the grating shriek of another unseen terror echoed through the rain. But inside the bedroom, there was only the terrible, stifling presence of the beast. Exhaustion began to poison Wilhelm's blood. The violent, uncontrollable tremors of an adrenaline crash racked his chest, aggravating his bruised ribs with every shudder. His eyelids turned to lead. He fought to keep them open, his mind desperately scanning the pitch-black doorway for movement. The heavy breathing in the doorway seemed to layer over itself, thick and rhythmic. In Wilhelm's ringing ears, the unrelenting drumming of the rain against the roof began to warp. The patter of water on shingles twisted into the wet slap of the Inquisitor hitting the stone. Wilhelm squeezed his eyes shut. It was just the house, just the storm. But the hollow thumping of his own exhausted heart hammered in his ears, mimicking the heavy thud of boots beneath the floorboards. The breathing was gone. Wilhelm's grip on the crossbow slackened. His chin dropped against his chest. His body screamed for relief. His body gave out, falling into the drowning pull of sleep, completely at the mercy of the creature in the dark.